Before we dive into the topic, here's a quick disclaimer. My financial journey is still a work in progress. If you clicked on this video looking for an easy checklist answer or a magical manifestation ritual, you won't find it here, so please don't waste your time. What you will find here, though, is a radically honest and very deep reflection on the dramatic path I've undertaken over the last 7 years. This is a chronicle of how I lived through a brutal financial crisis in the midst of my inner transformation, and the psychological conclusions I've arrived at today using every ounce of my knowledge and research. So if you feel there is something valuable in this for you, stay with me. Let's begin. We have to be honest here. The financial question is probably the most burning, raw and visceral topic for every single one of us. It is often even more pressing than relationships or love because we live in a solid material world. We need to eat, we need to dress ourselves, we need a roof over our heads, and let's face it, we want to enjoy life. We are constantly told that money is purely a matter of effort. The societal script says, work hard, put in the hours, and you will have it all. But what we actually observe in the real world flatly contradicts this rule. We see one person laboring heavily their entire life, barely scraping by pennies, while another is accidentally born into a wealthy family and lives without a single financial care. It might feel deeply unfair, but the real injustice, the real paradox, lies somewhere else entirely. We are taught that money is a reflection of our value or our hard work, but it isn't. Money is actually about your fundamental right to occupy space in this world without anyone else's permission. Whether that permission comes from your actual parents or their proxy figures in the form of the state, an employer, or society. At its core, money is about separation. And this truth does not care whether you were born into a poor family or a rich one. Because here is the hidden law of inner transformation. It does not matter if you inherited wealth, built a successful career yourself, or spent your entire life in poverty. The moment you enter the process of returning to your authentic self, you will inevitably face a financial crisis. A financial crisis is not a side effect of separation. It is a structural part of it. Many believe that separation is simply when you move out, pay your own rent, or stop calling your parents every day. But the real exam of adulthood is passed not in the therapist's office, but inside your banking application. A financial crisis in the midst of separation is rarely just a logistical failure. It is an unconscious, visceral attempt to hit the absolute bottom in order to find something to push off from. And this path is universal, because true separation is in essence a form of death. It is the death of you as a part of whole, a fragment of the family system, and the birth of you as an independent entity. At its core, this birth of individuality, this separation, is the moment we reclaim all our scattered projections from the outside world and return them inward. This is how we attain inner wholeness as distinct personality. And here lies the ultimate paradox of the path. Further down the road of awareness, you will inevitably come to realize the non-existence of the I, the illusion of the personal self altogether. But the joke of life is that you cannot bypass the steps. You cannot dissolve a personality that you haven't first gathered into a unified whole. You must become a sovereign subject before you can transcend the subject entirely. In this sense, the collapse of your familiar reality is an archetypal milestone, and your financial crisis is simply the most dense, material reflection of this inner death. If you look closely at human history, this exact painful descent in the search for a true self is mapped out across every major spiritual, philosophical, and scientific tradition we have ever created. It is Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, crossing the threshold into the abyss. It is the 22 major arcana of the tarot, crashing from the emperor's false security into the total destruction of the tower. It is the descent down the Kabbalistic tree of Sephirot from the crown of ideals down to the raw survival of Malkuth. It is the Vedic and Egyptian chakras, forcing energy down into the root before it can safely manifest. It is the myth of Inanna and Persephone, stripped naked at the 7 gates of the underworld. It is Nietzsche's three metamorphoses, where the heavy camel must become a roaring lion to fight for autonomy. It is the Gnostic hymn of peril, awakening from the numbing sleep of material comfort. It is Odin hanging from the world tree, denied all food and water to birth the secret runes. It is Siddhartha Gautama escaping his father's golden cage and facing starvation to find true abundance. It is Dante's Divine Comedy, walking through the absolute bottom of the inferno to reach the stars. It is Carl Jung's individuation, or what we call separation. Even in physics, there is a singularity point, that precise moment where all previous laws break down and a completely new universe is forced to be born. Every single tradition says the same thing. To find your true gold, you must first experience the total collapse of what you thought kept you safe. In this sense, my story is not just a biography, it is a modern depiction of initiation, a living blueprint of grand archetypal processes. In mythology, this is called the descent into the underworld. When the external attributes of the persona die off, only the core remains, the authentic self. And today, to make sense of this profound collapse, I'm going to use the 4-stage alchemical framework. Why alchemy? Because it is simple, beautifully structured, and deeply intuitive. Alchemy describes this process as the transmutation of one substance into another, and these exact stages are endured by anyone attempting to break away from their parental orbit. Alchemy speaks the language of gold and the philosopher's stone, making it the ultimate bridge between the transmutation and the reality of your material wealth. But most importantly, it is the very map that inspired Carl Jung to decode the human psyche. This aligns beautifully with the fact that I will be sharing this through the lens of my own experience, healing the Electra complex, the father's daughter, a concept introduced by Jung himself, which we explored in detail in the previous episode. But do not rush to close this video if you feel this doesn't apply to you. It is crucial to understand that these mechanisms are universal. They apply to anyone striving to become their authentic self. The Electra complex in psychology is simply a highly amplified, intensely dramatic facade of what every human being undergoes during true adult separation. Many people think that money is just digits on a screen, but for a woman carrying the Electra complex, money is heavy lead. It acts as weights chained to her ankles, tethering her to the parental home, to the image of the good girl, and to an endless, unpayable debt toward her father. Through her lens, financial loss can be seen as if under an X-ray. For Electra, money is truly the last battlefield on her path to separation. Why? Because our relationship with money is an exact duplicate of our childhood attachment. When the significant adult in your life, the one you depended on for survival, was emotionally unavailable, distant, or traumatizing, you develop what psychology calls an avoidant attachment style. This is how financial sabotage becomes your ultimate defense mechanism. You eliminate your wealth through sudden artificial emergencies, urgent repairs, or overextending yourself to save everyone else. And this brings us to the deepest symptom of this trauma: hidden debts. This is the highest, most toxic form of avoidant behavior. A profound core shame prevents the Electra daughter from ever asking for help. So instead of asking, you accumulate silent debt, drowning in a frozen solitary trap. But before we begin our descent into the alchemical stages that break this cycle, we must address the ultimate paradox, the concept of the golden cage. Many people think that material wealth is an indicator of separation. It is not. On the contrary, it is frequently the strongest chain available, a golden one. Talking from my own experience, for a long time I had what the world calls financial success. I wore expensive clothes, dined in fine restaurants, indulged in high-end hobbies like equestrian sports, owned a separate apartment, drove a car, and traveled the world visiting nearly 30 countries. From the outside, I looked completely independent, but the brutal truth was that despite all this material comfort, I remained utterly unseparated. My story is a chronicle of breaking that very chain to find a truly independent internal source, even if it meant starting from absolute zero. We often wonder, how is it that some people who are totally unseparated from their parents are incredibly wealthy? The answer is simple: they are operating on rented resources. The wealth of an unseparated person does not belong to them, it belongs to the system, whether parental, ancestral, or corporate, granted to them under very specific conditional terms. The system provides resources strictly in exchange for absolute loyalty. As long as you maintain the facade of the perfect child or build the exact career your father can boast about, you will have access to funds. But this isn't your gold, it is a golden chain. There are two primary dimensions of this illusion. First is money as a leash. For many unseparated individuals, massive wealth is merely the price tag of their compliance. The system feeds the child only as long as the child plays the role of its psychological extension. The moment you, whether you are an Electra daughter or anyone else fighting for autonomy, attempt to become yourself, the resource is instantly cut off. Many wealthy people are actually living in deep debt to their past. Their accounts are full, but they cannot spend a single coin on anything that contradicts the script of their inner father. This is not ownership, it is a lease. The second dimension of this illusion is the capital of the persona. While I was aiming for political heights or working with a Nobel Prize-winning organization, I had money. Why? Because I was serving the image of the brilliant daughter who brought pride to the family system. The world pays your mask, not you, and the moment you decide to strip away that mask, the money attached to it vanishes into thin air. This is perhaps the most terrifying threshold of separation, realizing that your past financial well-being was actually the salary paid for your own absence. Never compare your financial deficit with someone else's systemic surplus. There are people whose bank accounts are overflowing, but whose true selves are held as collateral by their parents. Financial separation is a profound transition from quantity, how much resource you have on lease, to quality, how completely that resource belongs to your authentic self. True financial freedom begins when you decide to trade that chain for your sovereignty. And that path always leads through an alchemical transformation. Let us look at how we transition from the heavy lead of our past into our own sovereign gold. Step 1 is NIGREDO. In classical alchemy, the magnum opus, the great work, never begins with light. It begins with NIGREDO. This is the stage of blackening, purification, and total decomposition. To create the philosopher's stone, the alchemist must take the raw material, place it in the vessel, and allow it to rot. All previous structures, forms, and boundaries must be completely destroyed and reduced to ash. Nigredo is the forced dissolution of everything that was once familiar, comfortable, and stable. It is the mandatory darkness before any light can exist. When Nigredo enters your life, it manifests as the sudden, violent collapse of your external pillars. This is the moment your old ways of functioning, driven by status, social recognition, parental approval, or correct corporate image, flatly stop working. It feels like a localized apocalypse. You experience a profound state of disillusionment, apathy, and an intense loss of meaning. Old rules which form the old self no longer bring happiness, but because the true self has not yet been reached, you enter a terrifying psychological limbo. The natural instinctive response to this is a total retreat. The individual goes into refusal. They abandon their career, cut off social communications, and isolate themselves in a desperate, blind attempt to let the old persona die. In the context of money, this is the exact moment your old ways of earning, driven by status, parental approval, or a correct image, abruptly stop working. But here is the hardest, most brutal part of the process. While you are inside the vessel of Nigredo, you understand absolutely nothing. Events just happen to you. Money simply stops coming. Work simply stops working. Your creative and professional engines completely freeze. The psychological processes governing your reality at this point remain entirely unseen, buried deep in the unconscious, until they aren't. But that sudden awakening will only happen much later, long after you have lived through the debris of this experience. This total blind helplessness is precisely why people get terrified by this mass. They panic and run away, breaking the alchemical vessel and retreating back into the safety of the golden cage. They mistake this structural liquidation for a mere logistical failure. But the true separation is relentless. It demands that you return the system's property. It is not a financial failure. It is the raw, visceral act of returning borrowed goods and rented resources to the family or corporate system. You are forced into a state of temporary, grinding poverty because you must become nothing to the world before you can find yourself. Only on the other side of this darkness will you finally look back and realize that your past money wasn't your gold. It was heavy, suffocating lead. It was a weight chained to your ankles, dictating exactly who you had to be, how you had to behave, and what mask you had to wear to deserve it. My personal Nigredo was not an overnight crash. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution that began when I stepped away from a prestigious organization into the total unknown. When it started, I was operating in a state of a classical warrior animus, fiercely advocating for my country at war. My identity was entirely wrapped up in this noble, high-status armor when a tumor suddenly forced a total physical and professional halt. At this critical threshold of vulnerability, I still possessed my own real estate funds and bonds, yet when my father insisted on paying for my surgery, I accepted. This wasn't a conscious mistake or a rational choice. It was a deeply ingrained, unconscious safety loop. In a moment of extreme physical helplessness and fear, the Electra daughter instinctively crept back under the protective wing of the patriarch, reinforcing the very dynamic I needed to break. This choice became the ultimate anchor, a threshold that triggered a forced, brutal separation through absolute deprivation. The moment I recovered, I left everything. I abandoned the career, walked away from lucrative contracts, dropped friends and social connections, and completely disappeared from social media. I retreated into a tight hermit shell to attend a writing school and immerse myself in esoteric studies worldwide. To fund this transition, I liquidated my entire safety net, using the money from selling my real estate and bonds to cover my life expenses. But within a single year, that independent capital completely ran out. The silent, cold condemnation of my parents grew suffocating. They were utterly shocked that I had thrown away a brilliant career for nothing, wondering what sect I had joined because I was entirely alone, speaking to absolutely no one. The psychological noise became unbearable. I maxed out the credit limits across 3 different banks. As the interest accumulated, my accounts were completely frozen, and debt collectors began calling relentlessly. I was trapped in a state of total defense, forced to turn off my phone just to escape the noise, watching my entire financial facade turn to ash. What does psychology say about this frozen trap? My blocked credit cards were the perfect physical mirror of my blocked emotions. This is where the mechanics of an avoidant attachment style intersect with financial crisis. When you grow up with an emotionally unavailable or traumatizing parental figure, money, which inherently represents care, resource, and security, becomes deeply warped into your psyche. The brain unconsciously flags it as dangerous, unsafe, and volatile. Therefore, financial sabotage becomes the ultimate defense mechanism for the Electra daughter. Subconsciously, the mind operates under a terrifying script. If you have money, you are visible, you are an adult, and you are guilty of betraying your father's control. To escape that unbearable guilt, you unconsciously bleed resources dry until you are entirely invisible again. You force yourself into a state of lack just to return to the familiar comfort zone of "I need nothing, I can handle this alone." Furthermore, a profound core shame prevents you from asking for help. For the perfectionistic Electra daughter, to ask means to expose an imperfection. It means shattering the image of the faultless, self-sufficient child and risking total rejection. My journey to the point where I didn't even have money to buy a single apple was the physical enactment of this exact psychological impasse. It was the absolute bottom of a child's helplessness and abandonment, brought about by the ego's refusal to drop its mask of perfection. But you cannot hide in the darkness of the ash forever. Once the old identity is completely burned away, the raw material must undergo a profound, painful purification. And that agonizing cleaning process takes us directly to stage 2, albedo. After the pitch-black decay of nigredo comes albedo, the stage of whitening, washing, and purification. In the alchemical laboratory, the ash left from the burnt material is subjected to relentless, repetitive washing, called ablutio. The goal of albedo is to separate the pure substance from the psychological dross, to clear away the soot so that the silver light of the moon can emerge. Albedo is a deeply reflective, quiet, but agonizingly cold stage. The fire of destruction has died down, and you are left in a sterile, stark space where you must look at your raw reality without any illusions. In life, albedo manifests as a period of profound cleaning and internal audit. The old identity has been burnt to the ground, and now you must slowly, painfully assemble the fragments of your authentic self. This is the stage where you begin to find your true voice. Perhaps you start a creative project, launch a channel like myself, or begin writing the truth you kept hidden. But because you are doing this while entirely naked, stripped of your social titles and your family's protection, the external world feels freezing. The biggest trap of albedo is the immense gravity of the old system. The psyche is exhausted from the darkness of nigredo, and it will use any opportunity to sabotage the transformation and crawl back to the familiar warmth of the golden cage. In the context of wealth, albedo is the empty nest or empty pocket stage. It's how the transition from rented capital to sovereign capital happens. The old, easy, leaden money is gone. If any money comes during this stage, it comes in tiny drops, strictly as a reflection of your authentic effort. The financial crisis here mutates. It is no longer the chaotic shock of blocked cards, it is the calculated, conscious choice between physical survival and spiritual sovereignty. It is the moment where you are forced to answer the question, are you willing to sell your true voice back to the system just to secure your dinner? The tips of financial literacy here don't work because albedo demands that you learn the spiritual value of a single dollar earned from your authentic core. At this moment, a person understands for the first time, I am alive even when no one helps me. This is the birth of self-reliance. You are not your diplomas or your car, but what remains when all that disappears. When the old decorations completely crumble, you enter a stage of absolute clinical purity. In my case, this albedo lasted for a grueling month of literal physical starvation, running parallel to the intense, frantic creation of my first podcast. At some point, the reality hit me. I had no food and I didn't have a single coin even to buy myself an apple. During that initial stage, I was deeply immersed into studying ancient Vedic texts. I distinctly remember the first day without a single bite of food. A profound, heavy weakness washed over me, a fatigue so intense that I could no longer read, process, or watch the materials I was trying to study. Falling asleep that night was an agonizing struggle, and by the end of the second day, I felt a visceral sensation that I was literally dying. This was not a voluntarily spiritual fast. This was a forced, desperate starvation, magnified by a suffocating fear of the unknown. Yet, when you lack the funds for a single apple, you are stripped of all noise. Hunger becomes the ultimate crucible. When your physical body has nothing left to consume, your ego finally shuts up. It was precisely inside this vast emptiness on that second day of starvation, while my head was spinning from weakness, that my first podcast forced its way out of me. In that exact state, having not eaten for 2 full days, I created my YouTube channel and immediately recorded 3 entire episodes. Paradoxically, physically my body had absolutely no strength left, yet my internal energy felt infinite, because it was the raw, unyielding power of the authentic self finally breaking through the dense layers of parental need. Sustaining the energy to record multiple episodes after 2 days of starvation is a classic indicator of tapping into an archetypal source that exists entirely outside the material plane. It was a beautiful, creative womb, but it was also an unconscious self-punishment. The Electra archetype within me was actively punishing herself for no longer being the flawless, perfect daughter in the eyes of her family. And here is how the gravity of the family system works. The moment you begin to truly slip away into your own orbit, the system senses the breach. For instance, out of nowhere, right in the middle of this cold survival mode, my mother unexpectedly decided to visit and brought me groceries. Archetypally, it was the system throwing an involuntary safety line to a drowning extension of itself, trying to pull me back into the familiar dynamic. As the month progressed, I experienced several more episodes when I didn't eat at all for days at a time. My body rapidly adapted, my stomach shrank so significantly that a tiny amount of food would last me for days. But the psyche does not surrender its neurosis easily. It will always make a desperate attempt to return to the protective wing of the patriarch. I had zero money for groceries, but my car's fuel tank wasn't entirely empty yet. So in moments of absolute desperation, I would use that remaining gasoline to drive to my parents' house just to get a single meal. Right at the end of this month-long starvation loop, as the pressure mounted, My cousin appeared. Seeing the state I was in, he was completely shocked and gave me that deeply logical, rational advice. Family exists for moments like this. Put your pride away and ask your parents for help. Exhausted by the visceral terror of hunger and wrapped in the illusion of his rationality, I capitulated. I reached out and took my parents' money once more. For a few months, the physical pressure eased, but then the psychological price tag arrived. I began to feel an unbearable, suffocating weight. Even though I was keeping my project a secret and telling them nothing, I could feel the invisible threads tightening. I could sense their silent, heavy expectation that I would eventually explain myself, that I would come to my senses, and that everything would return to the way it used to be. The money carried an energetic tax that was paralyzing my new authentic voice. That was my true threshold. I realized that the golden leash was back on my neck. In a definitive act of sovereign defiance, I refused their money completely. I cut the cord once and for all. Instantly the hunger returned, but this time it was a conscious sovereign choice. To survive without their safety net, I began to physically dismantle my past. I started selling my expensive clothes and my personal belongings, my treadmill, my printer, my books, even my dishes. Items that once sustained my status and the illusion of perfection were literally converted into food, into raw, basic survival. More than that, I used the money from the sales to independently pay off the accumulating interest on my bank credits. I was no longer hiding from my financial reality. I was funding my own way out. I traded the facade for life. This was a deeply symbolic alchemical ritual. With every dress, every book, and every pair of shoes I sold, I was physically peeling off the leaden armor of the perfect, successful daughter. I was liquidating the facade of the Electra complex to fund the birth of the authentic self. Psychologically, this painful liquidation is the process of reclaiming your scattered projections. While you are wrapped in a dependency loop, whether it is the Electra complex or filial obligation or a corporate golden cage, your power, your value, and your right to exist are projected entirely onto the external authority figure. When you take their money, you validate the unconscious belief that without this system I will die. When I refused the money for the second time, chose to sell my personal belongings, and manually paid my own bank interest, the avoidant attachment style faced its final transformation. Using your last resources to cover your own liabilities, rather than waiting for a patriarch or a system to rescue you, is the ultimate act of psychological maturity. You stop hiding behind frozen panic and hidden debts. You weaponize your self-sufficiency, turning it into a tool of absolute liberation. Selling the luxury items of the old persona to fund both my survival and my responsibilities was my own declaration to the subconscious, but it applies to anyone walking this path. The mask is dead. I'm trading the quantity of rented wealth for the raw quality of my own sovereignty. You cannot step onto the next stage until the physical and financial residue of your false identity is completely cleared from your space. With the vessel washed white, the debts independently faced, and the false armor turned to cash for survival, the clutter is gone. The silver has been refined. And this pristine, empty state prepares us for the roaring fire of the unexpected miracles of stage 3, CITRINITAS. After the freezing start purification of albedo comes CITRINITAS, the stage of yellowing. In the alchemist's vessel, the cold silver moonlight transitions into the first warm rays of the sun. It is the phase of solarization, representing the awakening of light through consciousness and the first appearance of genuine gold. The raw material is no longer decomposing or merely being washed, it is being infused with divine fire. In alchemy, CITRINITAS is the transition from a passive state of survival to an active, magical act of creation. In life, CITRINITAS is often overlooked in modern interpretations, but it is the most miraculous stage. This is the point of singularity, birth out of total emptiness. It is the moment when you finally begin to act, build, and speak, not out of deficit, trauma, or a desire to prove your family wrong, but out of pure, raw, authentic interest. When the physical form is completely emptied of the old identity, the spirit becomes intensely active. You forge your magical weapon in the crucible of crisis. The ultimate symptom of CITRINITAS is the appearance of supernatural aid. When you take a definitive step toward your true nature, even if it looks like complete madness to the rest of the world, the universe steps in. Synchronistic events, unexpected allies, and unexplainable coincidences manifest out of thin air, proving that the hero never perishes when they are truly on their path. In the context of wealth, CITRINITAS is the moment you earn your very first independent resource directly from your authentic core. It might be a tiny amount, just $50, but its metaphysical value overweights the millions of a past life. The financial crisis undergoes a radical transmutation. You stop operating on rented resources and you realize that you are an independent subject, fully capable of generating resources completely outside of your ancestral lineage or corporate systems. This first sovereign money is the ultimate confirmation from the world. We need you for who you actually are, not for the mask you used to wear. My CITRINITAS didn't unfold in a straight line. It was a fierce battle between the birth of my voice and the dying gasps of my old life. The first spark of this stage actually ignited back during my first wave of starvation when my head was spinning from weakness. Having not eaten for 2 full days, I experienced that sudden, violent urge to create. I launched my YouTube channel and immediately recorded 3 entire episodes. That energy didn't come from calories. It burst forth directly from my authentic self, forging my magical weapon in the depths of deprivation. But as you know, the psyche does not surrender its neurosis easily. Following that initial breakthrough came the compromise, the rational advice from my cousin, the return to my parents' money, and the subsequent suffocating control attempt. When I finally cut that golden leash for the second and final time, I dropped straight back into the reality of hunger and began selling my belongings to pay off my bank interest and survive. Yet, throughout this entire chaotic loop of compromises, starvation, and liquidating my past, I never stopped making the podcast. I kept writing, editing, and uploading week after week. I was fiercely feeding my new path while my body was running on empty, eventually losing 10 kilograms. The physical reality remained brutal, and the hunger kept returning over and over again. One evening, completely exhausted by the endless cycle of selling my things just to buy food and face debt collectors, I opened my diary, sat in the quiet of my empty apartment, and hit a wall of absolute despair. I was ready to throw it all away and just give up. I didn't just plead for a miracle. I demanded some kind of a sign, some proof that all the suffering wasn't in vain, that there was an actual meaning behind this entire nightmare. The very next day, the response arrived. I received a random, unexpected social media message from an aura photographer, a man I had visited only once 2 whole years prior. Out of the blue, he told me that all his 3 assistants had suddenly fallen ill right before a major private event. Driven by a blind instinct he couldn't explain, he reached out to me asking if I could step in and assist him for the day. When events like this unfold, they carry a precision that makes the word coincidence feel laughably inadequate. It shakes you to the core, because you suddenly realize that the fabric of reality is intimately listening. I went to that event. That single day of work provided me with 2 free meals and exactly $50 in cash. To anyone else, $50 is pocket money. To me, it was manna from heaven. It was enough to secure my basic survival and buy groceries for 2 entire weeks. But most importantly, it shattered my doubt. It wasn't just cash. It felt like a cosmic signature confirming that I was being looked after. When you remain relentlessly loyal to your mission, it feels like the universe assumes the responsibility of keeping you alive. What shifted psychologically in this moment? What is the profound difference between the massive wealth of my past life and those specific $50? The difference is that the past millions were paid to my persona. They were the salary paid for my own absence, funded by a controlling family script. Those $50 were paid directly to my authentic self. By materializing that money through a completely illogical, unpredictable synchronicity, I felt like the universe validated my existence, as if it said, I see you, not your father's ambitions, not your prestigious titles, but you, and I will provide. This is the exact threshold where the Electra complex dissolves. The illusion that without the patriarch's protection I will die is shattered by the raw reality of a $50 bill earned in total alignment with your nature. You realize you are no longer an object to be funded in exchange for obedience. You are a sovereign subject. You are the source. With the first spark of sovereign gold safely captured, the dawn is complete. The fire of your own essence is now burning bright, paving the way for the final, permanent crystallization of your power. And that brings us to the ultimate coronation, stage 4, RUBEDO. The final stage of the magnum opus is RUBEDO, the reddening. After the blackening of NIGREDO, the whitening of ALBEDO, and the yellow dawning in CITRINITAS, the alchemist raises the heat to the absolute maximum. The silver transforms into gold. RUBEDO is the stage of crystallization, where the spirit is completely integrated into physical matter. It is represented by the Red King and the Philosopher's Stone, a state of total structural wholeness, sovereignty, and the final stabilization of your power. In life, RUBEDO is the coronation of your authentic self. You stop surviving, you begin to occupy your true place in the world with calm confidence. You speak your truth globally, and you take full ownership of your authority. However, RUBEDO is not a sterile, static, happy ending. The biggest illusion of inner transformation is the belief that once you touch your gold, the path becomes a straight line of endless growth. In reality, the moment your authentic self attempts to scale, expand, or step into a completely new league of visibility, it encounters the final, most desperate resistance of the old programming. The deeper layers of unconscious guilt and ancestral fear, which lay dormant while you were just trying to secure your dinner, suddenly wake up. The system attempts one last violent coup to drag you back into the shadows. In the context of wealth, RUBEDO is the ultimate mastery of sovereign capital. It is the stage where your authentic work establishes a stable, solid foundation in the material world. However, it is at this highest stage of integration that a phenomenon known as the RUBEDO crisis or the second NIGREDO often occurs. When you attempt to scale your sovereign income, the system forces a temporary contraction to test your new boundaries. But a RUBEDO financial crisis is fundamentally different from a NIGREDO crash. In NIGREDO, you are blind and helpless. In RUBEDO, when the floor drops beneath you again, you are already armed with consciousness. You look at the financial contraction not as a fatal failure, but as a diagnostic mirror. You immediately realize this deficit is not a logistical problem. My expansion has triggered a hidden script of self-sabotage, and I need to find the root. In my case, following the miracle of those first $50, the universe kept its promise. 6 months later, the new infrastructure of my life began to organically solidify. Through YouTube monetization, Telegram donations, and private consultations, my income reached a stable plateau of $500 in good months. For the first time, the desperate physical survival mode ended. I was beginning to master my new world. But true RUBEDO demands a final, flawless settlement of all karmic and legal debts. For me, this materialized through 2 painful but vital steps. First, cutting the final legal umbilical cord. I still draw a car that, while used by me, was legally registered under my father's name. In the psychology of complexes, this is a classic marker. You think you are driving your own life, but legally, on the level of authority and roots, you still belong to the patriarch. I made the conscious decision to sell that car. I handed every single cent of the sale price directly back to my father, keeping only the exact amount required to fully wipe out my remaining bank debts. By doing this, I officially exited the toxic game of who owes whom. Second step, the adult sacrifice. From those hard-earned, sovereign $500, I independently paid near half in taxes according to Ukrainian law. Paying those taxes was my ultimate declaration to the world. I am no longer an exempt child being looked after in a patriarchal playroom. I am a sovereign player who pays her own share into the collective system. Psychologically, I ceased to be a daddy's girl. I became a woman funding her own existence. With my vessel washed white, my debts cleared, and my car sold, I felt an exhilarating, authentic impulse to take my work global, to launch an English-speaking channel, the very channel you are watching right now. And the moment I made that sovereign decision to expand my visibility, the floor dropped beneath me again. Suddenly, the revenue from my primary channel plummeted. The steady flow of consultations and donations dried up overnight. Once again, I found myself facing financial contraction and bank debts. This is precisely the RUBEDO crisis, and it is perceived with an even more agonizing, brutal intensity because of where I am physically standing right now. Technically, I am still living in an apartment owned by my family. It belongs to my mother, but that changes nothing. It is still the physical soil of the old system. I know with absolute certainty that to complete my separation, I must leave this place forever. I have already stripped my life of all excesses. I have dismantled the old facade to the point where everything I own fits into a single piece of carry-on luggage. I am physically and spiritually packed, ready to walk away at any moment and never look back. Yet, right at this literal threshold, as I stand with my suitcase in an empty apartment, ready for the final leap, the financial freeze locks me in place. Today I look at this reality not with frozen panic, but with the sharp light of consciousness. I understand exactly what this crucible is. It is a threshold, stepping out to speak to the world in a second language while preparing to physically cut the final tie to the family nest, breached a boundary of safety that my unconscious mind is still desperately trying to protect. My expansion triggered a dormant, terrifying ancestral program, the fear that if I become globally visible and leave the family perimeter, I will completely outgrow my roots, betray the system, and perish in the wilderness. To escape that terror, the subconscious breaks the financial engines, trying to force me to stay small, safe, and sheltered inside their walls. I want to be completely, radically honest with you. This is where I am standing right now. My process is not finished. I am recording this from the inside of active crucible of my own RUBEDO crisis, standing next to my carry-on luggage. Psychologically, this final loop proves that financial liberation is never a logistical trick. It is the continuous, lifelong labor of the true self. When you expand your territory and reach for a global scale, your all avoidant attachment patterns and your internalized Electra guilt will always flag your independent success as a dangerous betrayal. But the philosopher's stone is not created by running away from the fire. It is created by staying inside the vessel, by refusing to panic, by refusing to crawl back to the protective wing of any patriarch or system, and by continuing to record and upload this very podcast despite the temporary freezing of my resources, I am actively rewriting my neurological code. I'm forcing my unconscious to realize that my visibility is safe and my autonomy is absolute. Money flows in permanently only when you reclaim your authentic self, when you no longer need to play the role of the compliant Electra just to earn the right to exist, to feel comfortable, or to succeed. Transformation is not a story of how I effortlessly fixed my finances. It is a raw, ongoing chronicle of how I broke my false identity to retrieve the true self. The fire is still burning, the gold is still crystallizing, and the great work continues. But now I know that authentic self is the only account that can never be frozen. This carry-on bag next to me isn't a sign of poverty. It is absolute freedom from excess lead. Today my real gold is not a balance in a bank account, it is my sovereignty. My physical belongings may fit into a small bag, but my voice can now reach the entire world. My story is a living illustration of how the gold of the authentic self is forged directly from the heavy lead of debt, isolation, and fear. If you are in a financial or personal crisis right now because you dare to pursue change, do not fear the void. Do not run back to the familiar warmth of your old leaden cage. Trust the emptiness. That is exactly where your real life begins. But I want to leave you with one final, deeply human truth. While standing at this final threshold, I have realized something else. It is incredibly exhausting to constantly exist in survival mode. It is profoundly draining to do absolutely everything alone. It is a brutal, heavy burden to live every single day for years on end with the relentless thought of physical survival at every waking moment. And despite that grinding pressure, to find the strength to persevere. It is terrifyingly hard not to become bitter, not to harden your heart, and not to lose your faith entirely. And as I stand here today, I feel an internal misalignment. I know that life shouldn't be this way. It doesn't feel right to pay such a devastating emotional price for freedom. Yet, right now, I still cannot see why this pattern is repeating or exactly how to fix it. I am not an enlightened guru standing on a mountain top, handing down finished scripts. I am a researcher recording this dispatch from the very center of the theater of war. I don't know why I felt so strongly nudged to share this exhaustion with you today, but I trusted the impulse. If you have watched this entire video and if something in my story helps you understand why this final weight feels so heavy, or if you see what I cannot yet see from inside my vessel, do let me know in the comments or send me an email if you prefer to keep it private. Thank you for walking this path with me. Until next time.